When we talk about the Civil War, the first thing that often comes to mind is slavery. And make no mistake, slavery was the undeniable, monstrous heart of the conflict. It was a moral stain, an economic powerhouse for the South, and a practice that horrified the North. But to say it was only about slavery would be an oversimplification. Imagine two distinct ways of life, developing side by side, but growing further and further apart. In the North, a revolution was happening, not one of muskets, but of steam and iron. By 1860, the North had become an industrial titan. If you walked through the streets of New York, Lowell, or Chicago, you'd hear the deafening roar of textile mills and the hiss of steam engines. This wasn't just a change in jobs, it was a change in the human soul. The North was becoming a land of free labor. The secret tension here was economic competition. Northern manufacturers wanted high taxes on imported goods to protect their young industries from cheap British products. They wanted a government that would build internal improvements, canals, macadamized roads, and the burgeoning railroad system. By the time the first shots were fired, the North owned nearly 70% of the nation's railroad tracks. This meant they could move ideas, people, and eventually, armies, at speeds the world had never seen. This information age of the 19th century created a culture of rapid progress and a belief in a centralized, powerful federal government that could steer the nation toward a modern future. The South, however, was a world away. It was primarily agrarian, a land of sweeping horizons and quiet heat. But don't let the silence fool you, the South was incredibly wealthy. In fact, on the eve of the war, the Mississippi River Valley had more millionaires per capita than anywhere else in the nation. But that wealth was built on a foundation of King Cotton. The invention of the cotton gin by Eli Whitney decades earlier had accidentally fueled a monster. It made cotton so profitable that the South became a monoculture. Why? Because the South sold its cotton to England and bought manufactured goods back. A tariff was essentially a tax on the Southern way of life to pay for Northern progress. This created a deep-seated resentment. To the Southern planter, the North was a tyrannical force, trying to drain their pockets to build bridges in Ohio. They clung to the doctrine of states' rights, arguing that the Constitution was a voluntary compact. If a state felt the federal government was overstepping, that state had the right to ignore those laws or even leave. Beyond the money and the politics, there was a secret cultural war brewing. The North was becoming a melting pot. Thousands of German and Irish immigrants were pouring into northern ports, bringing new languages, religions, and ideas. This made the North more diverse, more urban, and more focused on social reform. Movements like temperance banning alcohol, women's suffrage, and, most explosively, abolitionism were catching fire. The South saw this as chaos. They viewed themselves as the true heirs of the American Revolution, gentlemen farmers who valued tradition, honor, and a rigid social hierarchy. They looked at the wage slaves in northern factories, people working 14 hours a day in dangerous conditions, and argued, hypocritically, that their system of enslavement was paternalistic and more stable. Here is a secret that the history books often gloss over. The North was growing much faster than the South. In 1790, the populations were nearly equal. By 1860, the North had 22 million people, while the South had only 9 million, and nearly 4 million of those were enslaved people who had no political voice. The South realized they were losing the numbers game. They were losing control of the House of Representatives. Their only hope to protect slavery and their economy was to keep a balance in the Senate. This is why every single time a new piece of land was added to the U.S., whether it was from the Louisiana Purchase or the Mexican-American War, it triggered a national heart attack. Will Kansas be free? Will Missouri be slave? These weren't just questions about geography. They were questions about survival. To the South, if they lost the ability to expand slavery into the West, the institution would eventually suffocate and die. To the North, if slavery expanded, the free labor system would be destroyed by unfair competition. This wasn't just a political debate. It was becoming a physical one. In the halls of Congress, South Carolina Representative Preston Brooks famously beat Northern Senator Charles Sumner unconscious with a cane over a speech about slavery. In the West, bleeding Kansas saw neighbors literally murdering each other over the ballot box. The stage wasn't just being set. The curtains were already rising on a tragedy. The North and South were no longer speaking the same language. They shared a border, a history, and a flag, but they no longer shared a vision for the future. The brewing storm was a collision between an industrial future and an agrarian past, with 4 million human beings caught in the middle, praying for a storm that would finally break their chains. For decades, America had been held together by a series of desperate political band-aids. But by the 1850s, those band-aids were being ripped off, leaving a raw, bleeding wound. The politics of this era weren't just about speeches. They were about survival, and the secrets of how power shifted would change the world forever. The death of the old guard for years. The American political system was dominated by two main parties, the Democrats and the Whigs. They were national parties, meaning they had members in both the North and the South. But as the 1850s rolled on, a secret poison began to dissolve them. Sectionalism. The Whig Party literally collapsed under the pressure of the slavery debate. From its ashes rose a new, terrifying force for the South, the Republican Party. This was a sectional party. It didn't even try to win votes in the South. Its entire platform was built on one goal: stopping the expansion of slavery. To the South, the rise of the Republicans wasn't just a political shift. It was a declaration of Cold War. The Dred Scott bombshell in 1857. A secret deal within the Supreme Court led to one of the most infamous decisions in history. The Dred Scott v. Sanford case. The court didn't just rule that a slave couldn't be free. They went much further. Chief Justice Roger Batoni declared that black people were not citizens and had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. But the real secret explosive was this: the court ruled that Congress had no power to ban slavery in any territory. This effectively made the Republican platform illegal. It meant slavery could potentially spread into every corner of the American West. The North erupted in fury. They saw a slave power conspiracy, a secret group of Southern aristocrats controlling the White House, and the Supreme Court to force slavery down the throats of every American. The Lincoln-Douglas debates. The audition enter Abraham Lincoln. In 1858, he was a relatively unknown corporate lawyer from Illinois. He wasn't the great emancipator yet. He was an underdog, challenging a political giant, Stephen A. Douglas, for a seat in the Senate. The secret to Lincoln's rise was his voice. He didn't sound like a polished politician. He spoke with a high-pitched, Midwestern twang. But his logic was rich. During their famous debates, Lincoln trapped Douglas into admitting that people in a territory could technically exclude slavery, even after the Dred Scott decision. This Freeport doctrine made Douglas a traitor in the eyes of the South and made Lincoln a superstar in the North. Lincoln lost the Senate race, but he won the secret audition for the presidency. John Brown's raid. The South's worst nightmare while politicians argued. A radical named John Brown decided the talk was over. In 1859, Brown and a small band of followers attacked the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. His secret plan: to seize thousands of weapons and start a massive slave uprising across the South. The raid failed, and Brown was executed, but the secret shockwaves it sent through the South were irreversible. Southerners found letters in Brownie's pocket from the secret 6'6" wealthy Northern businessmen who had funded him. To the South, this was proof. The North wasn't just trying to stop slavery in the West. They were planning to send terrorists to the South to murder families in their beds. The Southern militias began to train in earnest. They weren't just preparing for a parade. They were preparing for a revolution. The election of 1860. The point of no return as the 1860 election approached. The Democratic Party, the last thing holding the country together, split in two. The Northern Democrats supported Douglas. The Southern Democrats walked out and nominated their own candidate. This split was the secret key that opened the door for Lincoln. Lincoln's name wasn't even on the ballot in 10 Southern states. He didn't need them. The North had become so populated that he could win the presidency without a single Southern electoral vote. When the news hit that Lincoln had won, the South realized they were no longer part of the conversation. They were a minority in their own country. The secret secession winter between Lincoln's election in November and his inauguration in March. The United States began to vanish. South Carolina left first, followed by the Deep South states. But here's a secret many people forget. Secession wasn't unanimous. There were many Southerners who wanted to stay in the Union, but they were silenced by a wave of pro-war fervor. In the secession winter, Southern leaders began secretly and sometimes quite openly seizing federal forts, armories, and mints within their borders. President James Buchanan, a lame duck who was terrified of conflict, did almost nothing to stop them. He sat in the White House while the nation's military hardware was being stolen by his own cabinet members. Lincoln's secret journey to Washington, the tension was so high that as Lincoln traveled to his inauguration, his security team led by Allan Pinkerton, the founder of the Pinkerton Detective Agency, discovered a secret assassination plot in Baltimore. The president-elect had to be smuggled through the city in the middle of the night, disguised in a soft hat and a long coat, arriving in Washington, D.C. like a fugitive rather than a leader. The South mocked him as a coward, but the reality was far grimmer. The leader of the free world was being hunted before he even took the oath of office. The inaugural warning on March 4th, 1861. Lincoln stood on the steps of the unfinished Capitol building. The dome was covered in scaffolding and cranes, a perfect metaphor for a nation under construction that was falling apart. In this speech, he issued a secret ultimatum. He told the South, "In your hands, my dissatisfied fellow countrymen, and not in mine, is the momentous issue of civil war." He was telling them he wouldn't start the fight, but he wouldn't let them walk away either. The spark was now a glowing ember, hovering just inches over a mountain of gunpowder. The world was about to explode, and the secrets of the North versus South were about to be written in blood on the battlefield. We have to look past the grand oil paintings of generals on horses. The real secrets of the Civil War were found in the mud, the hospital tents, and the shadows where the first modern intelligence networks were born. This was the moment warfare transformed from a Napoleonic game of honor into a terrifying industrial machine of death. The bloody fields, secrets of the first modern war narrator. If the politicians provided the spark, the soldiers provided the fuel. But there is a secret about the American Civil War that most people do only realize. It was the world's first modern war. This was the bridge between the age of knights and the age of tanks. For the first time, the industrial secrets of the North met the warrior culture of the South, and the result was a level of carnage that the human mind was not yet prepared to process. The secret of the mini-ball, why the death toll was so high in previous wars. Like the American Revolution, soldiers used smoothbore muskets. They were notoriously inaccurate. You could stand 100 yards away and be relatively safe. But a secret piece of French technology changed everything. The mini-ball. This wasn't a round ball. It was a conical lead bullet with a hollow base that expanded when fired, catching the grooves rifling inside the gun barrel. Suddenly, a soldier wasn't just pointing a gun, he was a sniper. Muskets were now accurate up to 500 yards. The tragedy. Generals on both sides were still using old-school tactics. They would line their men up in tight rows and march them across open fields. They were marching 18th century formations into 19th century lead. This is why battles like Antietam became the bloodiest single day in American history, with over 23,000 casualties in just 12 hours. The technology had outpaced the strategy, the invisible front. The spy secrets while men were dying in the trenches. A secret war was happening in the parlors of Washington and Richmond. This was the golden age of Take the story of Rose O'Neal Greenhow, a high society widow in D.C. She was a Confederate master spy who used her charm to get secrets from Union politicians. Her most famous secret, she sent a coded message tucked into a woman's hair bun that alerted the South to Union troop movements before the first Battle of Bull Run. One secret likely saved the Confederate Army from early defeat. On the Union side, you had the Pinkerton National Detective Agency. Allan Pinkerton didn't just protect Lincoln. He set up the first Secret Service. His spies would slip into Southern camps, pretending to be laborers or travelers to count tents and cannons. However, Pinkerton had a secret flaw. He was terrible at math. He consistently overestimated the size of the Southern Army, making Union General George McClellan too terrified to attack, which actually dragged the war on for years longer than necessary. The secret heroes, women, and the Underground Railroad. One of the best-kept secrets of the war was the role of women on the front lines. It wasn't just about nursing, it was about combat. Historians estimate that hundreds of women secretly disguised themselves as men to fight. They cut their hair, wore loose-fitting uniforms, and took on aliases like Franklin Thompson or Jack Williams. They lived in the dirt, fought in the trenches, and were often only discovered when they were wounded and taken to a field hospital. Then there was the secret army of the Underground Railroad. During the war, this network didn't just help people escape. It became a military intelligence wing. Harriet Tubman led a secret expedition at the Combahee River, using her knowledge of the terrain to help Union gunships bypass Confederate mines, then called torpedoes. She became the first woman in U.S. history to lead a military assault, liberating over 700 enslaved people in a single night. The secret horror of the field hospital: if you survived the mini-ball, you then had to survive the doctor. At the start of the war, the secret of germs was still unknown. Surgeons would go from one patient to the next without washing their hands or their tools. They believed that loadable pus, the discharge from a wound, was a sign of healing, when it was actually a sign of a deadly infection. With the mini-balls shattering bones into hundreds of tiny pieces, doctors didn't have the time or technology to rebuild a limb. They had to take it. A skilled surgeon could amputate a leg in under 10 minutes. The secret of the pile was a horrifying sight. Outside hospital tents, literal mounds of arms and legs that reached the height of a man's waist. But out of this horror came the secret of survival. Clara Barton and Dorothea Dix revolutionized the way we treated the wounded. Barton realized that the secret to saving lives wasn't just surgery. It was speed. She brought supplies directly to the front lines, creating what we now know as the First Aid Station, ironclads and torpedoes. The secret of the Seasville War wasn't just fought on land. In 1862, a secret weapon appeared that made every wooden navy in the world obsolete overnight: the ironclad. When the USS Monitor met the CSS Virginia at the Battle of Hampton Roads, it was like a scene from science fiction. Two metal monsters hammered at each other for hours, the cannonballs simply bouncing off their sides. The South, lacking a traditional navy, turned to secret weapons out of desperation. They developed the AHL Hunley, the first submarine to ever sink a warship. It was a hand-cranked metal tube that was essentially a floating coffin for its crew, but it proved that the secret of naval warfare was shifting beneath the waves. The secret of the black soldier: for the first 2 years, the Union secretly refused to let black men fight. They feared it would upset the border states. But after the Emancipation Proclamation, the floodgates opened. Nearly 200,000 black soldiers joined the Union Army and Navy. These men fought with a secret level of motivation. They weren't just fighting for a flag. They were fighting for their own humanity. At the Battle of Fort Wagner, the 54th Massachusetts proved that they were just as brave, if not braver, than any white regiment. Their presence changed the math of the war. Every time a black soldier stood his ground, he was secretly killing the ideology that the Confederacy was built upon: the silent witness. Photografisa. Final secret of Section 3 is how the public saw the war. For the first time, photographers like Matthew Brady and Alexander Gardner took their heavy glass plates onto the battlefields. Before this, war was depicted in heroic paintings. But when the public saw photos of the dead at Antietam, showing bloated bodies lying in the mud, the secret of war was out. It wasn't a grand adventure, it was a mass grave. This visual reality brought the war home to the North and South in a way that words never could, creating a war weariness that would eventually force the conflict to its brutal conclusion. April 1865. The Confederacy was a ghost. Richmond, the Southern capital, was in flames, not set by the North, but by retreating Southerners who didn't want their tobacco and supplies to fall into Union hands. The secret of the end wasn't a grand, final explosion. It was a slow, exhausted collapse. But as the smoke cleared, the United States faced a question more dangerous than the war itself. How do you put a broken family back together when the house is burned to the ground? When General Robert E. Lee realized he was surrounded at Appomattox Courthouse, he didn't call for a guerrilla war in the mountains, which he could have done. Instead, he met Ulysses S. Grant in the parlor of a private home. The secret of this meeting was the incredible mercy Grant showed. Following Lincoln's private instructions to let M up easy, Grant allowed the Confederate soldiers to keep their horses so they could go home and plant crops. He gave them food from Union stores. He even allowed the officers to keep their sidearms. There were no mass executions, no chains. Grant understood that if the North treated the South like a conquered colony, the war would never truly end. As Lee rode away, Union soldiers began to cheer, but Grant stopped them. "The rebels are our countrymen again," he said. Just 5 days after the surrender, the ultimate secret plot was executed. While watching a play at Ford's Theater, Abraham Lincoln was shot by John Wilkes Booth. The secret many people don't know is that Booth wasn't a lone wolf. He was part of a larger conspiracy to secretly decapitate the entire Union government. His team was supposed to kill the Vice President and the Secretary of State at the exact same hour. They failed in the other assassinations, but they succeeded in killing the one man who had the political secret to a peaceful Reconstruction. Lincoln's death changed the DNA of the peace. Without his brilliance and his charity for all, the North became vengeful, and the South became defensive. The secret of what could have been remains the greatest what-if in American history. While the war was ending, the secret of freedom was being codified. Lincoln had pushed through the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery forever. But here's a secret many overlook. The amendment left a loophole. It abolished slavery except as punishment for a crime. In the years following the war, Southern states used black codes to arrest formerly enslaved people for minor crimes like loitering or not having a job. They would then lease these prisoners back to the same plantations they had just been freed from. This was the secret of slavery by another name, a shadow that would haunt the South for another century. In the decades after the war, a new secret began to take hold in the South, the myth of the lost cause. Former Confederate leaders began to write books and give speeches claiming the war wasn't about slavery at all, but about honor and Northern aggression. They erected hundreds of statues and rewrote school textbooks to hide the secret of the slave power that had actually started the war. This secret history was so successful that even today, many people are confused about why the war was fought. It was a masterpiece of propaganda that allowed the South to lose the war on the battlefield, but win the secret war for the American memory. For a brief moment after the war, during a period called Reconstruction, the world saw a miracle. Black men were elected to the Senate and the House of Representatives. Schools were built. New lives were started. But there was a secret resistance brewing. By 1877, the North, tired of the conflict, secretly agreed to pull its troops out of the South in exchange for a contested presidential victory, the Compromise of 1877. The secret was that the North gave up on the civil rights of black Americans to achieve political peace. If you go to the battlefields today, there is a secret peace there. But if you look at the soil, it's still marked. From the sunken road at Antietam to the Devil's Den at Gettysburg, the landscape holds the memory of 620,000 souls. The Civil War remains the secret key to understanding modern America. Every debate we have today about the power of the government, the rights of the states, and the reality of racial justice is just an echo of the cannons that fired at Fort Sumter. So, what is the ultimate secret of the North versus South conflict? It's that a nation is not a piece of paper. It's not a border on a map or a set of laws. A nation is a promise. The American Civil War was the moment that promise was tested in a furnace of fire. It was the moment the United States decided whether it would be a collection of warring tribes or a single, unified people. It was a tragedy of immense proportions. Yes, it was a story of blood and betrayal. Absolutely. But it was also the moment that 4 million people finally saw the sun rise on their first day of freedom. The scars of the Civil War are still visible, if you know where to look. They are in our politics, our culture, and our hearts. But the biggest secret of all, we are still here. Through the smoke, through the fire, and through the division, the Union survived. The question for us today isn't who won or who lost, it's whether we have the courage to keep the promise that so many soldiers died to protect. Because the story of the Civil War isn't just about the past. It's about the secret future we are building every single day. By 1863, the American Civil War had reached a terrifying equilibrium. The South was winning battles, but the North was winning the war of secrets. While General Robert E. Lee was performing tactical miracles on the battlefield, the Union was quietly building an unstoppable industrial and political machine that the South simply couldn't match. This is the story of how the tide didn't just turn. It was dragged across the finish line. The secret of the Anaconda Plan at the start of the war. A veteran general named Winfield Scott proposed a strategy that many laughed at. He called it the Anaconda Plan. The secret wasn't a sudden strike, but a slow suffocation. He wanted to blockade every southern port and seize control of the Mississippi River. By 1863, The secret was working. The South was an export economy. They needed to sell cotton to buy shoes, guns, and medicine. But the Union Navy had formed a steel ring around the coast. The secret of the Southern shortage began to bite. In Richmond, the price of a loaf of bread rose by 700%. Women famously rioted in the streets, breaking into stores because they couldn't feed their children. The South wasn't just being outfought, it was being hollowed out from the inside. Gettysburg. The secret of the high-water mark in July 1863. The war reached its most famous turning point. Gettysburg. But there is a secret to why Lee was even there. He wasn't just trying to win a battle. He was trying to feed his army. Northern Virginia had been picked clean of food, and his men were barefoot and starving. He invaded Pennsylvania to secretly seize supplies in hope that a victory on Northern soil would force the Union to give up. For 3 days, 160,000 men clashed in the Pennsylvania heat. The secret of the third day was Pickett's charge. Lee ordered 12,000 men to march across a mile of open field directly into the center of the Union line. It was a massacre. As the survivors limped back, Lee realized his invincible army was broken. But here is the real secret. On the exact same day Lee was retreating from Gettysburg, the Union achieved an even bigger victory in the West. General Ulysses S. Grant captured Vicksburg, Mississippi. This gave the Union total control of the Mississippi River, effectively cutting the Confederacy in half. Texas, Arkansas, and Louisiana were now secretly isolated from the rest of the South. The Emancipation Secret. A war for souls while the guns were firing, Lincoln was playing a secret hand of high-stakes poker. The Emancipation Proclamation was more than a moral document. It was a military masterstroke. By declaring the enslaved people in the South free, Lincoln ensured that England and France, who had already abolished slavery, could never secretly intervene to help the Confederacy. If they helped the South, they would be fighting for slavery. It also triggered a secret strike across Southern plantations. Enslaved people, hearing rumors of the proclamation, began to slow down their work or walk away entirely, heading toward Union lines. The Southern economy, already struggling, began to collapse as its labor force disappeared. The secret of the unconditional surrender Grant 4 years. Lincoln had struggled with slow generals who were afraid to lose, but in Ulysses S. Grant, he found his secret weapon. Grant understood a dark truth that other generals ignored. The North had more men. Grant's strategy was arithmetic. He knew that if he kept attacking, even if he lost more men than Lee, the North could replace their losses and the South couldn't. This led to the Overland Campaign, a series of non-stop, bloody battles. The secret was that Grant never retreated. After every battle, instead of going back to Washington to lick his wounds, he ordered his army to move further south. The secret of Grant's will was what finally pinned Lee down in the trenches of Petersburg. Sherman's secret. Bringing the war home while Grant pinned Lee down. General William Tecumseh, Sherman launched the most controversial secret of the war. Total war. Sherman realized that to end the war, he had to break the spirit of the Southern people, not just their army. He abandoned his supply lines and marched to the sea through Georgia. His army lived off the land, burning crops, destroying railroads, bending the tracks into Sherman's neck tees, and seizing livestock. The secret of this march was psychological. By showing the South that a Union army could walk through their heartland unhindered, he proved the Confederate government could no longer protect its citizens. War is cruelty, and you cannot refine it, Sherman famously said. He wasn't trying to be a villain. He was trying to make the war so painful that the South would never want to fight again. The election of 1864. The secret ballot that saved the Union money. People, do you want to know that Lincoln almost lost his job in the middle of the war? By late 1864, the North was exhausted. Thousands were dying, and the war seemed endless. Lincoln's opponent, George McClellan, was running on a peace platform, promising to stop the war and let the South keep their slaves. Lincoln secretly prepared for defeat, writing a letter to his cabinet stating he would help the next president save the Union before the inauguration. But then, the secret of Sherman's victory in Atlanta hit the newspapers. Suddenly, the North saw that victory was possible. Lincoln won in a landslide, and the secret of the Peace Party vanished. The South's last hope for a political exit from the war was dead. The infrastructure secret. The rail and the wire, the final secret of the North's dominance, was technological. In the Union's War Department, Lincoln had a telegraph office. He spent more time there than anywhere else, secretly micromanaging his generals in real time. The South didn't have this level of connectivity. The North also had the secret of the standardized rail. In the North, most trains used the same size track. In the South, different states had different track widths. A Confederate train carrying supplies would often have to stop at the state line, unload everything, and put it on a different train. This logistical nightmare meant that while the North was moving like a modern machine, the South was moving like a collection of disjointed tribes.